morning, and welcome back to the Carsey Policy Hour. The Carsey Policy Hour is the UNH Carsey School of Public Policy's monthly discussion series, engaging policymakers, public service professionals, and others curious about the issues and policies that affect the Granite State. As folks are trickling in, please note your name and affiliation in the chat so that we know who's here. One common question: yes, presentation and slides will be online by Friday. If you missed last month's Carsey Policy Hour on lawsuits, courts, and executive authority with UNH law professor and constitutional law scholar Daniel Pye, I'd encourage you to check that out as well. It is aging well. Our series partners are the New Hampshire Municipal Association, the New England Municipal Sustainability Network, or NEMS, and New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training. We are also thrilled to welcome a fourth partner in the New Hampshire Association of Counties, or NHAC, reflecting Carsey's commitment to elected officials and public servants at all levels of government. NHAC represents the interests of New Hampshire's 10 counties through training, advocacy, intergovernmental relations, and resources related to the efficient operation of county government in New Hampshire. Welcome, NHAC members. Today, we are in for a treat with Carsey's own Stephen Bird. Stephen joined Carsey as director on July 1st, the same day as President Chilton, what feels like a very long 9 months ago. Stephen is also a professor of political science and has expertise in energy policy and regulation broadly, with a deep focus on impacting the energy transition. His current research and engagements focus on energy conflict and polarization, also what drives acceptance of energy sources ranging from fracking, solar, wind, also smart housing and split incentives between owners and renters, and energy technology, such as microgrids and green data centers. Stephen, I didn't think I would be back on my winter heating source yesterday, curled up next to my wood stove with snow flurries outside. But in recognition of the 56th Earth Day later this month, talk to us about the ongoing energy transition and the effects of Trump administration policy and other market and environmental factors. Folks who have joined us today, again, please put your name and affiliation in the chat. Also, as Stephen is talking, put your questions and comments in the chat throughout the presentation. Identify yourself in each remark if your Zoom ID is unclear, and we'll have a rich discussion after Stephen finishes the presentation.
Thanks, Yusi. My name's Stephen Bird, and I'm I still count myself as a newbie as the new director of the Carsey School here at the University of New Hampshire. The Carsey School has been around for a little more than a decade. I'm its second director. And we have 4 superb research programs focused on impact finance, engaged communities, social policy and practice, and demography, and 4 really great master's programs, 3 online and 1 in person in public policy, public administration, conflict, and community development. And I would be remiss, the University of New Hampshire is in the middle of its annual fundraising, and the Carsey School's superb work is in part supported by people who support us. And we have a link there for the 603 campaign for Carsey. And I encourage you to support us in whatever amount might work. I'm going to structure my conversation today into 3 sections. I'm going to try to remind folks of a couple of kind of key components and set the context. And then I want to talk a little bit about the current state of play, both on a national level and also in terms of implications for New Hampshire. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the global situation because I think it has really important contextual implications for the United States and certainly for New Hampshire and other states. So with no further ado on Earth Day, let's jump in. And the first thing we want to remind ourselves is whether you agree with it or not, or whether you like it or not, we're in the middle of an energy transition. It's a massive global structural change to the entire energy system. It affects supply and consumption. And it is absolutely at this point in time a transition to renewable energy and to clean energy sources. And I can talk about that context just a little bit more. But it's really important, and it's a massive train at this point. The train has left the station. The electric train has left the station, arguably. And happy to talk about why. And the challenge here, of course, is in any change, in any large scale or abrupt change, policy change creates winners and losers. And that has created a very difficult context in the United States, and globally for that matter, in terms of how fast that transition occurs and in what ways change affects different interest groups and constituents across the global and national landscape. And the driver of this particular transition is the challenge we face with climate change. We're in it now. We're seeing the beginnings of sea level rise, fires, smoke, drought, migration, large-scale storms, disease impacts. These costs that we're paying, whether it's for Hurricane Sandy or large-scale tornadoes up north in Canada that we've never seen before. They have enormous costs. Right now, we're seeing challenges with the entire housing insurance industry in Florida. And those costs are going to continue. And so I think it's a real challenge for people who are thinking about the clean energy transition, who characterize it as something that won't cost us. It will cost us, for sure. And it's really inappropriate to say it won't. The challenge is if we do nothing, it will cost us far, far more, roughly 2 to 3 times the amount. And the data and the evidence for that is really not something I spend a lot of time arguing with about, but it is really, really clear. And we're seeing those costs increase faster than we thought. But I'd like to remember that, or remind folks, I should say, that this energy transition actually has its roots further back in history. This quote, the energy conservation is the moral equivalent of war. That's a fairly stark statement, especially from a mild-mannered peanut farmer. That was Jimmy Carter in 1977 in response to a war in the Middle East. Sound familiar? And OPEC's oil embargo, and the United States was facing unheard of gas lines and energy shortages, and it was a very, very challenging time. We had large-scale shortages in natural gas in the Midwest that shut down factories. And so Jimmy Carter had a fireside chat and started to tell people, we've got to do something different. Incidentally, this was the beginning of a large-scale research enterprise in a wide variety of new technologies by the United States, including the development of solar and solar technology that the United States would soon become a world leader in. And so our energy transition actually has roots not really starting with climate change. That was just an add-on, but rather roots that had us thinking about energy security and energy independence as far back as the 70s. 2 additional pieces, well, really 3 here, are context that is worth thinking about. The first is the emergence of a technology in the United States that we've had since the 1940s, fracking. But what changed in the late 1990s into the early 2000s was real advancements in that technology that made it possible to take out large amounts of oil and gas stuck in the ground in areas that we did not previously think we could access. And so the simple matter is we have vast resources of shale oil and shale gas that we're now able to extract at a cost and scope and scale that was not really available to us before. That has turned the United States into a net energy exporter. We were already an energy superpower. We have energy in every conceivable context you can imagine: oil, gas, coal, wind, solar, nuclear, hydro. There is no area where the United States is not strong in energy. And then the other real important revolution was the beginning of the renewables burst that continues to this day, and we're in the middle of an S-curve transition that is really starting to take real speed. But in 2019, renewables consumption surpassed coal, which was the mainstay energy source through much of the 20th century, and really pushed us forward onto this energy transition. And the last piece of context that I think is really incredibly important is that the context of United States land law, the United States political systems, and the current space that we find ourselves right in increases our potential for energy conflict. And I'm working on a book on energy conflict that will come out, I'm hoping, next year. We have very, very strong land rights and a very strong ability in the legal system to sue. And we have a deeply polarized political system, driven in part by the structure of majoritarian politics, that has created a real challenge in terms of developing a coherent, long-term energy strategy for the United States. So energy politics have become one of those places, a third rail issue, much like gun rights and abortion, that is really problematic. And the last piece that's quite important is the role of the states in all of this. I like to use this term called energy regionalism. And this really structures us to think about how and in what ways energy interests play themselves out. And I've talked about all the strengths that we have in the United States in terms of energy. But the fact of the matter is, in the Northwest, much of the energy strength is in hydro, very cheap legacy hydro, also in the Southeast in Tennessee Valley Authority. In the Midwest, we have enormous resources in the form of wind, but also coal and shale oil. Our coal states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, have enormous amounts of that legacy hydro fossil fuel, or legacy fossil fuel, excuse me. And then places like California in the Northeast don't have a lot of this, although the Northeast has a lot of biomass. So what happens is when we make energy decisions, and a decision might favor one type of energy source over another, you get lots and lots of conflict. And so we see this in the United States, and we see it in other places as well. But some countries are lucky. They just have one energy source. And so it at least makes it easy to make national level decisions about energy. The other key component in the United States is that we have very strong federalism, lots and lots of role for the states. And so an enormous amount of our energy policy is actually decided at the state level. And this map shows you an example of that. We do not have a national clean energy policy or a clean energy standard or a national renewable portfolio standard. All the kinds of policies that you would normally see in any other nation. But 75% of the United States population lives under some sort of clean energy standard or renewable portfolio standard. And it's this type of energy policy setting agenda that occurs in the states that is an enormous driver of a lot of that. What happens, even if we're not accomplishing a lot with a clean, coherent energy policy at a national level. And there's this complicated intermeshing and relationship between national level energy policies and state level energy policies. And so where does that leave us? It leaves us right now, and that renewable energy number, by the way, is higher as of 2024. I just couldn't find a nice graphic for 24. But we're still enormously reliant on fossil fuels, primarily oil and natural gas. The big changes have been a slow reduction in the nuclear portfolio over time, a really significant reduction in coal that's been primarily replaced by natural gas, and more recently by renewable energy. What's really interesting in this is that right now, the cheap source of energy is no longer natural gas. What we are seeing is solar growth surpassing natural gas. And so just in the past year, in 2024, we installed 50 gigawatts of solar capacity in the United States. This is just a massive, massive level, far surpassing any other energy source of any type in terms of growth. So all of the new growth going forward is going to be coming out of solar. And this is primarily because the cost has become so affordable. And we still have a variety of incentives in place to push us on that path, both at the state and national levels. And here in New Hampshire, we have some differences from that sort of national snapshot I just gave you. The first thing is that many of our households use petroleum products, propane, natural gas, or oil heat for our primary heating. This is a very large share in the U.S. And the other differentiator for New Hampshire is wood and biomass as a primary heat for about 1 in 16 New Hampshire households. We also have a very high nuclear portfolio. We're a small state in New Hampshire, and we're getting about 56% of our generation from Seabrook, and then a much larger percentage from renewables, about 18%. And that's a real mix, small scale solar, but hydro, biomass, and wind as well. And the other change, quite different from the rest of the Northeast, is that we have 2 remaining coal-fired power plants in Portsmouth and Bow, but those are scheduled for retirements very soon. And what we have been seeing is that coal is becoming more and more expensive to run. And there's a long story there that I won't go into right now. So that sort of sets us up to think about what is the current state of play. And I'm going to talk first a little bit about the national scope, and then I'm going to talk about some specific issues here in New Hampshire, and then move on to thinking about the global context. If you're not aware, the Trump energy agenda is unchanged from 2016 and 2017. We are seeing already the adoption of a wide variety of regulations to encourage oil and gas to open up new drilling in the Arctic, in Bureau of Land Management land, and we will expect more of that. In the first Trump administration, we saw well over 100 different regulations emerge that were, in general, supportive of oil and gas. The other thing we can expect, although we don't have this on the radar yet, is continuation or increase of subsidies for nuclear, carbon capture and storage, which enables the potential for carbon reduction with oil and gas. That's probably a good thing on Earth Day. And lastly, some other technologies, including geothermal. I haven't quite figured out why the Trump administration is interested and willing to work with geothermal, but we'll see how that goes. The other component in all of this, and again, similar to 2017, but perhaps with a much more aggressive policy pursuit, is really comprehensive environmental deregulation. This is in emission standards across vehicles and power plants. And it's not always about deregulation, because sometimes that's hard to make happen fast, but at a minimum, lowering enforcement standards. We're expecting the Trump administration to fight and try to find another Supreme Court venue to remove the 2009 endangerment finding for the regulation of greenhouse gases. The Supreme Court, in a lawsuit by Massachusetts, found that greenhouse gases were indeed something that the Clean Air Act had to enforce it as a pollution. And then the last component is any kind of equity-based policy in the context of environmental justice or low-income energy programs, energy efficiency, particularly if those programs target the aged, rural populations, race, a whole set of different kinds of components. So this idea that has emerged in the last decade of trying to assess and think about energy burden and energy poverty for low-income groups, or for systemic ways in which energy is not available to some parts of the United States, is likely going to go away. And of course, the last piece is 10 to 25% tariffs on energy coming into the country. And this is mostly about Canada, which I will come back to in just a minute, but also Mexico. But really importantly, the other thing I think that we're missing here is energy materials. And the supply chain component of the energy system in terms of extraction and production and overall supply is really problematic. And this includes for the oil and gas industry. It is simply not the case that the kind of parts that we need for pipelines, for factories, for generation plants, across the spectrum of both fossil and clean energy systems are all available in the United States. And so there is real concerns that the energy industry is going to start seeing increased costs associated with the fact that materials that they need for a wide variety of operations or continued development are not going to be available. And that's, I think, an important piece that has not been getting caught. Bear with me one here. I'm just telling Windows to go away. The second piece that I think is quite important and has a real context for New Hampshire is we are going to see either repeal or non-enforcement or at a minimum a set of lawsuits associated with the Inflation Reduction Act, which President Trump has really taken a dislike to. And the challenge here is the IRA has already created about 400,000 new jobs and about 600 billion in investment dynamics, including semiconductor plants in Syracuse, New York, car plants down in the Southeast, battery plants in Kentucky. I can go on and on and on. And so the great challenge here is that some of those things have already started, but may stop. Some of the funding is uncertain or locked. And I should note, particularly for transparency, but our Center for Impact Finance here at the Carsey School has had a real significant policy place in this, helping communities think through financial modeling and financial decision making, and helping credit unions develop a series of strategies for energy efficiency and solar and a whole host of other areas. And we will be putting a link at the Carsey Policy Hour's website to the programs. There's a lot of educational programs. Some of them are free, open, and online that are provided by the Center for Impact Finance. So I'm really proud of that work that they do. The other challenge is we're starting to see some economic analysis on what it's going to cost us to start with a giant $1/3 trillion piece of legislation, especially when you combine it with the Infrastructure Act. So there were two big pieces of legislation that came out under the Biden administration. And we're seeing costs associated with energy costs that would not be around through a variety of incentives and subsidies from the IRA that will be around about $32 billion from 2025 to 2035, and job losses and long-term GDP loss and CO2 increases associated with that. And as I mentioned, do expect to see pieces of support for the energy system, particularly in geothermal, nuclear, and oil and gas. Okay, so what does that do for the state of New Hampshire? And so far, it's a mixed bag. The IRA and infrastructure subsidies here in New Hampshire and the way that they're playing out are okay so far, but there's an enormous amount of uncertainty. Some of the funding is stopped. Some of the future funding is not expected to be forward. And what we're talking about for New Hampshire is about $250 million, $250 million in home weatherization, heat pumps, electric vehicle infrastructure, solar adoption, weatherization, et cetera. So many parts of that money are just uncertain. We don't know where it's going to go. And for sure, my understanding is that the governor and others are quietly advocating for keeping some of that money coming to the states. And this is one component of the way that the IRA was structured. The Inflation Reduction Act was structured in such a way that a lot of subsidies and goodies were coming to the states, in particular states sometimes that deep red, Texas, Georgia, Arkansas. And so the great challenge right now is that Republican governors in many of those states are really trying to advocate for many parts of the IRA that the Trump administration would like to get rid of. And where that plays out, no one's really sure. Here in New Hampshire, DES and DOE programs in solar and energy efficiency are for the most part still in place. There's a lot of complexity here. Um, and um, and again, we're facing enormous uncertainty with the New Hampshire budget negotiations. And those won't be resolved until June. But we may see very simply some programs end because federal funding ends. For sure, I expect a much small, if LIHEAP is kept, LIHEAP is the low income heating assistance program, and it's a really important program for low income people. It's particularly important in the North Country of New Hampshire, and we may see that program go away, and or we may see much smaller allocations come in. And as a result, you're going to see that kind of assistance for low income residents across New Hampshire lowered quite a bit. And the last piece in New Hampshire and everywhere else is that we're going to see substantial increases in the cost of energy. I have some data on electricity that I'll show you in a second. Oil and gas costs may stay moderate. Right now, there's a variety of reasons, that supply chain on the immediate end may stay in place. But if these tariffs continue, we will see oil and gas costs go up substantially, and for sure, the underlying cost of electric vehicles and other components of the clean energy system are going to be a little bit more expensive. The other thing to remember is that in the budget negotiations, New Hampshire lost the interest dividend tax, and that's created a huge hole in New Hampshire's budget. And so as a result, there's lots of pressure to reduce the size of programs or eliminate programs. But what's really interesting, and a little shout out here to Clean Energy New Hampshire, who have some absolutely phenomenal in the weeds legislative analysis available to their members. So thank you for that. Is what we're seeing is some of the more kind of big moves, if you will, more extreme legislation don't really seem to be moving forward and are not expected to move forward. We have the potential right now for net energy metering to potentially improve, although that is a real question mark. We're likely to see a clean energy option in terms of property assessed clean energy regulations come into play for commercial buildings, and that is a big money saver for the business sector. The renewable portfolio standard has been targeted to be slightly weakened, but not extremely. And there are proposals to weaken the Renewable Energy Fund. A couple of those big, but it's really not clear whether they will pass or not. The last piece that I want to talk about is in particular electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the state. We've seen some recent analysis come out looking at the challenges and problems of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which is really in its infancy in New Hampshire. We don't have a significant charging infrastructure. And here the challenge is our second largest industry is the tourist industry. And the problem that we face is that the people who will come to visit New Hampshire are going to be coming from Canada. Quebec, as a for instance, is going to be at 50% EV penetration by 2030. Same thing in Ontario. And we're seeing very big moves in Massachusetts and New York, both of whom's residents like to come up to New Hampshire. And the great challenge that New Hampshire faces is if we do not have charging infrastructure for those people who are coming to visit our state, they're going to go elsewhere. They'll go to Vermont or New York or Maine, where they can charge their cars. So even if we don't have a sort of nascent buildup of electric vehicles here in New Hampshire, the real concern is for how that will affect our $8 billion tourist industry. And speaking of Canada, the last piece that I think is really important to talk about, we get an enormous amount here in the New England area of our electricity from Canada at extraordinarily cheap and affordable rates. And overall, our energy trade in Canada, Canada-US energy trade is $100 billion every year. And that's across the scope, lots of electricity, lots of oil and gas from Alberta, and petroleum products and parts of the energy supply chain. And if the trade war continues in every aspect, we may see real problems. And Canada is, to be quite clear, you can see a picture of billboards that have been purchased by the government of Canada about the tariffs that are being placed in places like Florida, et cetera, really trying to impact or remind Americans of their concerns. And so this challenge is going to be long term if it's not resolved, and don't quite know where it goes. Canada has threatened to reduce or increase costs of electricity coming to the United States by quite a bit. NEISO has done some analysis looking at $66 to $165 million in costs, increased costs, just in New England for electricity. That's going to hit people's paychecks. Okay, so I provided some, kind of local context, and I want to provide kind of one more piece in all of this, and that is to really think through the global situation and how that might affect the United States trajectory in terms of energy policy and strategy. Global energy demand is growing, and interestingly enough, overall energy up 2%, but electricity up 4%. And the big piece to note in this is that globally, renewables are, again, the largest piece of the increase in energy infrastructure. And the other thing to remember is that 80% of that growth is occurring in the global south, in China and India, as those economies start to mature and develop. And the last piece is a really important reminder. Oil demand growth is slowing. It grew slightly in 2024, but for the first time, total energy demand for oil fell below 30%. That's the first time in 50 years that it's done that. That tells you something about the trajectory and the importance of oil in the overall energy system. We are at a point of tipping points right now. And when we think about climate change, we think about tipping points that are scary. The Arctic methane losing its frost and releasing massive amounts of methane, changes in ocean systems, a whole set of different pieces. But there are also tipping points in terms of clean energy systems. And this is where I really want to point out that the train really has left the station. So I mentioned before, right, the United States installed 50 gigawatts of new solar in 2024. That's really important. We're seeing tipping points occur in a variety of other areas. And what's happening is these changes in the energy system are occurring faster, in much, much faster than we really expected. So this is solar growth compared to predictions by the International Energy Agency. And all of those lower lines down on the right-hand side are predictions that they made over the last 20, 25 years. And then the big blue line is the actual solar growth. So again, if we're talking about a tipping point, we have moved into an acceleration of renewables right now. And you can see similar data for wind that is quite astounding and is outpacing any predictions that we had in terms of what to expect from these technologies. When I say the train has left the station, the United States is just matching that pace. But that pace in many other parts of the world is growing even faster than it is in the United States. And partly that's because we are now able to scale those systems up and they are enormously affordable. And there's other reasons for affordability here. And I'm just a note of caution. I can't emphasize every energy system that we have, if it's solar, if it's gas, if it's hydro, has problems, challenges, conflicts. There are siting issues with solar. There's concern for land use. We have similar kinds of environmental issues surrounding oil, gas, coal, wind, hydro. Every energy system, there's no silver bullet. So I don't want to pretend, oh, everything's rosy. Here's this beautiful renewable revolution. No, there are real problems and challenges associated with the development of these new forms of renewable energy and clean energy systems. But the other component here is our peaking, which is expected the next 1 to 3 years of global climate change. We are expected, our CO2 emissions are expected to peak out likely in 2028 in every scenario that that the International Energy Agency is looking at. And that's a really important reminder. Hitting this plateau allows us to start thinking about how we reduce. And the real question is not, are we going to reduce, but how fast we will reduce. And how fast we will reduce is going to mean the difference between 2.1 degrees, I don't think we'll make the 1.5 degree Celsius, or 2.5 or 2.7 or 3.1, right? 3.1 is a categorical global disaster. We're talking 7-meter sea rise, right? 2.1, we can probably adapt and be resilient. And so the real question, every 1/10 of a degree matters in this, is how fast we drop those carbon levels affects how much our temperature will increase. And this just gives you a sense of tipping points with electric vehicle adoption. The purple line, these are all graphs of countries that have hit a 10% threshold of new vehicle adoption that is electric or hybrid, and how fast the increase. So in 8 years, Norway went from 10% to approximately 80%. The vast majority of cars in Norway right now are emerging to be electric, and this is an extraordinarily cold climate. When people tell you, no, you can't have an electric vehicle system for 40 million people in a cold climate, Norway will tell you otherwise. China right now is ahead of its target for 20% EVs, going faster than we thought. Again, a new tipping point. And a great challenge for American car makers right now is they don't sell cars just in the United States. GM and Ford sell cars everywhere in the world. And again, if we're making primarily ICE cars here in the United States, the great challenge for American automakers is they need to compete in the global market, which is rapidly going electric. So the question is whether our role in the United States, in the energy industry, in the car industry, in every aspect of systems that use energy, if we're going to be in the lead, if we're going to be doing and developing new kinds of research and technology that will allow us to be dominant or to be a part of this leadership role, is going to be able to continue. And I simply don't know whether we'll be able to do that. Last tipping point, and then I'm going to open up for questions. Energy storage. This is the holy grail of renewables. Renewables are well known for being inconsistent. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. And so what you need is energy systems, solar and storage. You need combined energy systems that make sure that the energy is reliable and available at all hours. And again, similar to solar, and there's lots more data on this, we're seeing enormous growth and improvements in energy storage technology and its ability to scale up. And many of these technologies don't depend on rare earth metals or heavy metals that are dominated by a few key countries or by China. There's new storage technologies that are based on sodium, salt. And the other, of course, there's sort of technological storage systems that aren't based on technology. That includes things like hydro and hydro dams. So if you're able to set up hydro and combine it with intermittent energy systems, you've got another huge battery. There's a giant battery to the north of us in New Hampshire and Quebec. It's called the James Bay Power Project. So key takeaways. Here in the United States, there's no doubt under the Trump administration that energy transition is going to be slowed. But that's in a context where the market and global competition forces are going to have enormous momentum going forward. We'll see fossil fuel dominance or fossil fuel market share remain higher than it might have been otherwise under the Trump administration. So it's going to slow us down in that context. There are going to be real significant costs and concerns for the impact of tariffs across the energy system. And we may see some particularly painful effects here in New England because of our proximity to the border and our dependence on Canadian hydro. A third component is we're going to see a lot of leadership by states, regions, and cities that are going to be really leading the energy transition. And what we do, I think, is going to occur much more in places like New York or Massachusetts or California, but also, interestingly enough, places like Texas. Ironically, one of the largest wind shares in the United States, with some very forward-thinking policies on the development of wind and wind resources. I worry a lot about loss of leadership and market competitiveness for the United States in every aspect of the energy space. And the last point is that in the context of the Ukraine war and Europe's dependence on Russian gas, we're seeing almost a doubling down by Europe and other places on their commitment to a renewable energy transition. Short term, sure, they're increasing their consumption of US gas, but that is not a long-term solution for them, nor do they feel right now, at least, that the US is a trustworthy partner. So I'm going to stop there, and you see, I'm sure we have some questions, and really pleased to be able to talk about this with folks.
We absolutely have questions, and thank you so much, Stephen. That was fantastic. Feel free to close your presentation if you'd like, though we can draw up slides as you wish. Just wanted to note, we have a fantastic audience here today, organizations and roles, very diverse. We have Clean Energy New Hampshire, the Conservation Law Foundation, 350.org New Hampshire, so activists and researchers in this space. We have the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and the National Renewable Energy Lab at a national level. And we have municipal leaders. So speaking to your point about different levers at different levels of government, which is something we always try to address in the Carsey Policy Hour. So rich group, thank you so much. Keep the comments and questions coming. There's a conversation in the chat about carbon pricing and pricing in general. So on one hand, global fossil fuel use will be replaced when there's a meaningful price on pollution with various citations, and then warring citations. Energy prices have to quintuple before significant conservation occurs. So talk to us about carbon pricing, gas taxes, how to infuse further economic considerations into production and use.
Yeah. So this is a favorite topic of mine. Stop me if I go in the weeds. I'm a real fan of Leah Stokes. Leah Stokes is a political scientist out in the UC system in California, and has written extensively about the energy transition and is not a fan of carbon taxes and carbon pricing. Unlike most economists who will tell you that putting a price on an externality like carbon is absolutely critical. And the debate goes like this. Economists will tell you carbon pricing is the only way that you're going to get an appropriate market reaction in ways that account for the pollution and cost. The problem is everybody knows Superman and kryptonite, right? Carbon taxes are the kryptonite of the energy system. They are so disliked. So the one place in North America that legislated a really serious carbon tax, and is, by the way, remarkably like sort of, left wing, kind of think of it, California, the California of Canada, was British Columbia, instituted a carbon tax, and that included rebates for residents of British Columbia. And those rebates, by the way, were higher for people who were more truck or car dependent, but it was a really, really serious system. They are backtracking, and even despite those rebates, which generally came in December and were like substantial, $800, check comes into you in December, we're still universally detested. I've seen the public opinion data on this. Carbon taxes in Europe, Europe, home of $9 a gallon gas. We saw huge protests in France, the Gilets jaunes, shut down the country. And one of the reasons for the emergence of the National Front in France was because of France's carbon policies. So Leah Stokes has advocated for, and by the way, advised the Biden administration on the development of the IRA. And she said, every time we see carbon taxes, they don't work, they don't pass, people don't want them. Taxes, particularly in the United States, are a dangerous word. And so as a result, she says you have to develop a system that's based on incentives and subsidies, carrots, not sticks, to accelerate the clean energy transition. And by the way, those systems tend to have more stickiness. They stick around longer because nobody wants to get rid of a subsidy. You just have to find a way to pay for them. In the case of the Biden administration, they paid for them primarily through changes in Medicare prescription rules and a few other things. So this debate is a real one. I tend to lean towards the Stokes advice that you need large scale industrial policy that creates real incentives. And we saw that right away, right? A $500 million investment by Micron in Syracuse for semiconductors, huge investments by international car, battery, and energy companies in places like Kentucky, Georgia, Arkansas, Florida, states that really don't want to lose those jobs and that economic development right now that help put them in a leadership position. How this all plays out, I cannot tell you. But I do agree, like by far the most efficient way to address the challenges of carbon is via pricing. But it's very, very difficult to think about where the political will comes from that will maintain it and not create soft loopholes or weak taxes. If you are going to do it, I'm an advocate of cap and trade systems rather than a straight tax. It gives business more flexibility. But there we go. I'll leave it at that.
That's great. And there's again, a rich conversation in the chat, especially around the narrative and the narrative of what taxes, the benefits of taxes. John Gage also directs us to Canada, where the fossil fuel industry flooded Canadians with the axe the tax, and other, what he says are lies about how they were affecting the people. So the rhetoric and narrative being a key part beyond economic rationalism as well. I want to turn us to offshore wind, another area of interest here. 350.org noted that New Hampshire legislators are trying to ban this. We also have Mike Berman, expert from NREL, saying that this resource has been left off the discussion, but the international community has and continues to aggressively pursue it. So how do we view offshore wind and other new clean tech resources as fitting within the overall energy portfolio for New Hampshire, the region, and the US as a whole?
Yeah. So I was just reviewing actually Clean Energy New Hampshire's assessment of the potential ban for wind. And that is, my understanding is, and I could be wrong, is that is actually not expected to pass. Although the great challenge is, wind is dependent also on federal permitting and a whole host of other things. So at a minimum, we're not going to see more offshore wind anywhere. Any company involved in that right now is hesitating because these are massive, massive investments, like typically in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you have large scale risk attached to them, that's too scary for any large scale wind developer. So they're going to go install wind in other places and probably steer clear of the United States, at least insofar as the Trump administration is around. I think there is likely real concern in New Hampshire, as there is on the Maine coast and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, about impacts of wind on the fishing industry. But there's actually really extant existing examples of situations where the wind and fisher communities have been able to work in harmony and sometimes for synergies and sometimes a payment or a proxy tax or that goes specifically to the fishing industry has sometimes been for any disruption that occurs. So, nothing's going to happen with wind anytime soon. And we'll see. For New Hampshire, it's not going to be massive in any case because the amount of our shoreline is so small. It's a much bigger implication really for Massachusetts and Maine.
Yeah. Your presentation and the comments have brought me to previous Carsey Policy Hour and future Carsey Policy Hour topics, which I'll just throw in for anyone looking to learn more about community power, both the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire and community power as an approach to cooperative power purchases and generation. We have a recording on that. We've looked at split incentives, particularly within municipalities and what municipalities can do about that, and the split incentives between landlords and renters. And looking ahead this year, next month's Carsey Policy Hour is on the New Hampshire-Canada trade and tourism relationship. So a lot of the points you've raised about production and pricing, as well as tourists, their need or desire for EV infrastructure, combined with other geopolitical factors that might affect our tourism, will be discussed next month. And finally, in June, geothermal. We're looking at a unique relationship between Eversource as a utility and an activist organization, which led to the first utility-owned geothermal project. And so, in that vein, that wasn't a top-down, that was a lot of just local collaboration. States, regions, cities, what levers do states and cities and regions, what should we be looking at if they aren't already? And just one final note that a comment said that New Hampshire's governors have said that the clean energy policies of our neighbors are making New Hampshire's energy costs higher. So, again, the relationship between one entity making decisions that have adverse consequences or consequences on those around it.
Yeah, well, a great challenge there. I'm not so sure. Well, I would have to see some specific examples from governors in terms of how our neighbors increase costs for us. I think here's a broader question to think about, really, which is if we're thinking about community power. So, one, as a reminder for folks in the audience, right? The power system is becoming much more fragmented, much more diverse in sort of types and structures of different kinds of mechanisms by which people produce power, get it onto the grid. We see a lot in terms of distributed energy resources. I think in all of these, state legislatures have a real role to play in creating legislation that allows for some of these different kinds of models. But I think very, very importantly, and this is, I don't want to go into a large discussion of net energy metering. But net metering is a debate area that has become really, really problematic in a lot of states. And I think one of the challenges that we see in states that have been a little bit more thoughtful about net metering, they've been more careful to account for, number one, costs to low-income residents that don't have the potential or ability to put solar on or can't afford the higher costs associated with solar. And are also concerned about what happens if more and more people leave the utility, what that impact is for low-income ratepayers. And so the challenge in all of this is to create structures that account for those costs. What do we need to pay to maintain a large-scale interconnected grid? Even if that system is quite different, might involve microgrids or people who are mostly off the grid, all of that sort of stuff. So I think careful, thoughtful state policy that accounts for interests across the board is really important. And this is an area where, quite frankly, at a national level, Republicans and Democrats have both failed. They have failed to think about, if we are changing our energy system, how do we count for the workers in a coal plant, or people who are affected by a change in energy system overall. What do we do with those people? And neither party has provided a very good answer. And I think that's the reason we have a lot of dissatisfaction among many voters and many people who work in the energy industry. And I noted a comment about the coal plant in Portsmouth, right? The coal plant in Portsmouth does provide a potential intertie for offshore wind in New Hampshire. And if you have an upcoming closure of a coal plant like that, the big question is, are state lawmakers thinking about where do those people go next? Because the company that owns the coal plant is doing it, they're retiring the plant because it's no longer profitable, or because the kinds of retrofits it needs are going to be way more expensive. And so the big challenge here always is, can you create policy that's going to account for these changes and not disrupt people's lives so much? We're going to have enough disruption as it is, from climate change and a whole host of other ideas. So I think legislatures that pay attention to some of those kinds of opportunities and remind themselves that as our energy system is changing, we're going to need to account for some of these synergies and to account for some of these people who might be being left behind. That's really important.
Zooming out in the global context, Amy Trueworthy writes, the US has historically displaced environmental burdens either to the future or to other countries. We see examples of that displacement of burden with renewables as well. What global policies can reduce this reality of winners and losers? And she notes, perhaps we need to rethink our ways of life and redistribute global wealth.
Yeah, that's a real challenge. I mean, we're seeing the failure right now of a global system to address climate change. New Guinea just announced that it's no longer going to attend the COP meetings. They see them as useless. The COP is Council of Parties for Climate Change. There are real concerns right now that the rich nations are not actually adhering to the commitments that they've made to their INDCs. And so what would be really interesting for me to see, so as a general rule, I'm kind of a pro-markets person. There's a reason that we've seen movement of some factories, to other parts of the world, to Vietnam or Laos or the Philippines or Malaysia. And it's because it's very cheap, and then we then get the benefits of those cheap goods coming to us. And let's focus in the United States on the things that we do really well, better than other parts of the world. And there's a whole host of areas that we do really well. But I do see actually the potential value of having, for instance, environmental standards tariffs or human rights tariffs globally, right? Tariffs that simply say we want to, in the same way that we have, standards for coffee, and that's through a willing coalition of coffee growers, and fair trade standards is what I'm talking about. We might see the emergence of standards that are associated with environmental production that are real and serious, and that's possible. And similarly, standards for human rights. One concern I certainly have with the production of solar panels that have come from China, which incidentally is like making some of the cheapest and some of the best solar panels in the world right now, is the fact that some of those panels may have been made in factories that incorporate slave labor. And I would love to have an international inspection system that tells me, no, that's not the case. So that's where I see opportunity in the international space. And I think in the same way that we started to see a movement against sweatshops and increasing transparency for companies like Nike that used to have a terrible reputation that way, we might start to see the emergence of environmental and human rights standards in the energy system. That would be a real movement in progress.
Thank you, Stephen, for this overview and views into the future. We've reached the top of the hour, unfortunately. I think we could continue all morning, but just thank you for being here today on the call, for being here at Carsey and UNH. We really appreciate you. Folks on the call, we have, as I mentioned, two final Carsey Policy Hours for this year. On May 14th, Brian Gottlob, principal of Paul Econ Research and also director of New Hampshire's Economic and Labor Market Information Bureau, will be looking at New Hampshire's and Canada's trade and tourism. It should be a really fascinating discussion, including some of the energy components that we've talked about today. And then in June, as you know, the geothermal collaboration, a deep dive into what local actors and the private sector can do to help with the energy transition that we know is coming, but comes with fits and starts. So see everyone next week. Thank you, Stephen, and be well.